Hey guys, today we're going to take a look at compound interest. As I mentioned in our simple interest video, this is going to be a little more complex. It's going to be a rather lengthy video, I'm sorry, but there's a lot of steps to get through it. So first, let's just define some of our words. We talked about interest in the last one, so you know what interest is, but compound interest is calculated differently. This is interest that's paid on both the principal, which we defined in the last video, and the accrued interest, meaning the interest that's already been put in there as well. So instead of just getting interest on the principal, you're also earning interest or paying interest off of the interest that has compounded or been put into the account. That's what we mean when we say compounded. The balance refers to the sum of the principal plus the interest earned. And actually, what I'm going to show you through this video is we're going to calculate for the balance. That's what we're going to compute when we do all of our steps. If we just want the interest, and I think I mentioned this on the next one, we have to go back and subtract out our principal. So the first thing we need to do when we're doing this is we need to find the interest rate per period. And I'll explain what that means as we go. In order to do that, we're going to divide the annual rate by the number of periods. So what that means is a bank might say, well, we pay 6% annual rate. It's compounded quarterly. Well, quarterly means it's compounded 4 times a year. So that means each quarter you're earning 2%, okay? Because we're dividing the interest rate by the number of periods. So the important thing we need to copy down here, we need to know that quarterly means it's 4 times a year. Semi-annually means it's twice a year, and annually means only once a year. So these are going to be important because this is going to help us calculate what the rate per period is, be it a quarter, a half, or a whole year. Okay? That's all it's saying. So the first thing we have to do, and don't worry, we'll do some examples of this, is calculate how many periods is this interest going to be compounded, is basically what we're asking. And we need to figure out the interest rate per period is what we're saying. So how much interest is each period getting paid? Because you're not getting that 8% each period, you're getting 8% for the year. Depending how the year is broken down is going to depend how it compounds or how it adds up in your account. I'm going to be careful with this one because we're going to come back to this chart. This is a chart that can be found in your book as well and in the workbook. So don't worry, you don't have to copy this down. Please don't take the time to copy this all into your notes. It is in your book. I'm going to refer back to it a few times throughout the video when we do this. So after we find the interest rate per period, what we're going to do is we're going to use the rate and the number of periods that we've calculated to locate the factor on the chart. All right, and this is a chart we're going to come back to, so I'm going to explain that to you, and I'm going to show you how to locate everything that you need on this chart as well. Okay? Then finally, what do? We multiply the deposit or the principal by the factor that we found on that chart, and that will give us our balance. Our factor times principal gives us our balance. Most of the time, I'm going to ask you to calculate the balance. If I ask for just the interest, then what you have to do is you still have to do this operation, this calculation, because there's no way around that. Then you can take the balance, subtract out the principal if we just want to know the interest. So that's just a matter of paying attention to what it's asking you. Does it want the balance or does it want the interest? Which way is it being asked? So those are just, again, you have to be attentive in math and make sure you understand what it is they're asking you. So, for example here, Melody deposits $12,000 in a savings account for Sierra. The bank pays interest quarterly, so here I know that means 4 times a year. 4 times a year. Quarterly means 4 times each year. At an annual rate of 6%. So how much money will she have at the end of 1 year? So our first 2 calculations are pretty simple. How many periods is this going to be compounded? Well, I said quarterly, which is 4 times a year, and it's only 1 year. So take my 1 year times 4 times a year. That means there's 4 periods where this interest will accrue. Okay? Then we're going to figure out what is the percentage each quarter. Well, it's 6% for the year, it's quarterly, so there's 4 periods a year. So I'm going to divide my 6% annual rate by the 4 quarters, which gives me a 1.5 quarterly rate. Okay? These two numbers are the important ones because now we're coming back to the chart that I told you is important. And again, do not copy this down. You can find it elsewhere, so you don't need to take the time to copy this. 4 pay periods. So look here, the number of periods was 4 because it was quarterly for 1 year. And we said that it became a 1.5 rate. So the factor we want is 1.0614. And if you'll notice, I have already copied that down onto this one. So my factor from the chart is 1.0614. All right? So now all I have to do is I'm going to multiply. I'm going to take that factor. I'm going to multiply it by my principal. My original amount I said was $12,000. When I do that, here's the number I get, and then I just put our balance, and I added the 0 at the end. I used my calculator, so you'll notice it doesn't throw the 0 there. It doesn't know we're talking about money. I added my dollar sign and made it look more like money. So it's $12,736.80. That's the balance now, meaning all of the interest that has accrued plus the original deposit. Now, if I just wanted to know what the interest was, I would subtract my original $12,000 from this, and I would find out that in that year she earned $736.80 in interest, just in interest. All right? So that's just kind of a setup of how to do it, and we're going to practice that. So the first thing we're going to practice is just calculating our periods. How many periods do we have? And this is nice and simple multiplication. So it tells me it's compounded annually. Annually tells me once a year. So 1 time a year for 8 years, 8 periods. All right, this is actually quite easy, but it does kind of throw kids off sometimes, which is why we're doing it. So how do I figure out how many periods it is? Because this is another number that we need when we're locating the chart. We need this, and then what the interest rate per period is, okay? So all we're doing is multiplying the number of years by how many times it's compounded a year, which is why we need to learn these. Semi-annually means twice a year. So 2 times a year for 4.5 years gives me 9 periods, or 9 sets of time where they're going to compound by interest. Okay? Compounded quarterly. Quarterly means 4 times a year. I multiply that by the number of years. This is going to be 24 periods for which we are compounding interest. Okay? The last one, compounded semi-annually, which is twice a year for 6 months. This says months. We can't multiply it by 6. We want to deal with years. So 6 months is half of a year, or we could write it as 6 over 12. I like to write it in its decimal form, 0.5, 1/2. That's half a year. So I want 2 times half, which is actually only 1 period. So that's just how we calculate the periods. This is only part of solving the problems when we get to the problems. But I want you to get comfortable with figuring out how many periods there are. All right. I gave myself a lot of space here because there's multiple steps that we're going to go through. So just follow along here. All right. So here we're depositing $7,000 with an annual rate of 8%. It's compounded quarterly for 1 year. So the first thing I want to calculate is my periods. How many periods am I going to have? I said it's 1 year, and it's compounded quarterly, which means 4 times a year. So I have 4 periods. Okay? Then I need to figure out my quarterly percentage rate. So what is my quarterly rate? In order to do that, I'm going to take my annual rate, because they told me my annual rate was 8%. Quarterly means there's 4 quarters in 1 year, so that means it's 2% per quarter. I now have the information I need. I have to go back to my chart. 4 periods, 2% per quarter. Number of periods, so we're going to go down to 4. 2% a year. We're going to follow those 2 columns to where they intersect, the row and the column. I wind up with 1.0824. So that is the factor I need. I'll write it right here. 1.0824. Okay, so all of these calculations were simply to find the number that I need to multiply my deposit by. This is the factor I'm now going to multiply my original principal balance by in order to find the new balance, and we're solving for the balance. So to get the balance, all I'm going to do is do this multiplication, and I'm going to grab my handy-dandy calculator. 1.0824 times 7,000 gives us $7,576.80 as a new balance. Each time it's been compounded, the interest now adds into what it can be, into what interest can be earned on. So the chart is really important because the only other way to do it is incredibly long and time-consuming and irritating. So we're not going to try and figure it out each quarter, add that in, then calculate the new interest, and then add that in. Basically, we could calculate the simple interest each period, add it in, and then calculate a new simple interest. Would be the only other way to do that, and that would be incredibly time-consuming. Okay, so now let's look at our other one. Here I've got $10,000 at an annual rate of 7%. It's compounded semi-annually for 2 years. So first, let's figure out our periods. Semi-annually means twice a year. For 2 years means I wind up with 4 periods. Then I need to figure out my percentage for each half of the year. So I'm going to take my annual percent, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide it by how many periods there are in 1 year. There's 2 periods in 1 year. So each period earns 3.5%. Now that we have those numbers, we're going to come back to this chart. And let me double check my numbers. 4 periods at 3.5%. So here's 3.5, here's 4. Where do they intersect? 1.1475. So I'm going to write that down. 1.1475. That is the factor I'm now going to use to multiply my principal by. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to multiply it by 10,000. And I can actually do this one in my head. My balance is then, the joy of dealing with zeros, multiples of 10, I can do those in my head. $11,475 is your new balance. That's how much money you've accrued over those 2 years, with the interest being compounded semi-annually. Okay? This is more than if we did a simple interest. Simple interest doesn't earn you as much money because you're only earning on the principal. This adds a little more money for you to earn money on. So you're always going to wind up with more if you have compound interest. All right. Couple more examples. I know this is a little confusing, but the big thing is if you can remember how to read the chart, you're going to be fine. It's a multi-step process. That's the big thing. So I've got $5,000 at an annual rate of 8%, compounded semi-annually. How much interest is earned in 1 year? So what you'll notice is now the answer it wants is how much interest, not what's the balance. So we'll figure out how to do that at the end. First, let's figure out what our balance is. So for 1 year, semi-annually, that means our periods. Semi-annually is twice a year. For 1 year means I have 2 periods. All right. Now let's figure out our interest rate. If I have 8% annually, and it's compounded semi-annually, that means twice a year. That means I have a 4% interest rate per period. All right, now I have the information that I need that I can flip back to my chart. 2 periods at 4% gives me a factor of 1.0816. 1.0816. All right, so there's my factor. That I'm going to multiply by my original amount. Again, my handy-dandy calculator is going to do all the hard stuff for me. So 816 times 8,000. So my balance is $5,408. However, this wants to know how much interest did I earn. So of this balance, how much is interest? Well, we take our balance, we subtract out our principal, and we find out that $408 was the interest I earned in 1 year. Sorry, I can't talk and write. Interest. I don't like that R in interest. I try to leave it out all the time. All right? So just multi-steps. Just work your way through it nice and slowly. So I have $4,000 with an annual rate of 12% compounded quarterly. How much interest is earned in 2 years? So again, notice it's asking me for interest, not balance. Well, it's compounded quarterly, so let's get our periods here. Compounded quarterly, 4 times a year. I want to know for 2 years, so I have 8 periods. All right, now let's figure out what our quarterly interest rate is. 12% is my annual rate. I'm going to divide that by how many periods there are in 1 year. Quarterly tells me there's 4 periods in 1 year, which means this is 3% per quarter. All right, so I'm getting 3% per quarter for 8 periods. So let's flip back to our chart. 8 periods, 3% a year gives me a factor of 1.2668. 1.2668. There's my factor. That I'm going to multiply by my original principal balance, which was $4,000. And I come up with a balance of $5,067.20. And again, the calculator doesn't add to 0, but since we're dealing with money, we need to. However, this wants to know how much of that was interest, so let's take our balance, subtract out our principal, and again, you're not going to see me do the math, I'm just going to write the answer here. And I find that the answer for how much interest was earned is $1,067.20 in interest. All right, so the big thing there, don't get confused to if I'm asking for the balance or for the interest. And the big thing you need to remember is how to use the chart, because your first 2 steps get you the number that you need to get your answer, okay? And then just remember on the chart, find the 2 numbers that you needed, find where they meet in the middle, and that will give you the factor that you need, okay? And again, you don't have to copy down this chart. It's in your book, and I'll give it to you on quizzes or tests, all right? I don't expect you to memorize it. I know this can be complex and confusing, so feel free to rewatch it. It's always a good idea. You can always rewatch previous videos to help you out as well. Post your questions in the comment box or email me or ask me in class. I would love to go over this with you. You guys have a great night. See you tomorrow.